This is Update One, the podcast of the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. Update One provides a forum for listeners to learn about national and international stories, focusing on journalism and communication issues, news, and politics. Now, the latest edition of Update One. Most Americans are probably not aware of the number of wars currently being fought by the United States, where they're at, the number going on simultaneously, and the cost of those wars, both in terms of human life and dollars. Those are the topics on this edition of Update One. I'm Mike Hempen, a vice co-chair of the Broadcast Podcast Committee here at the National Press Club and a supervisor at the Associated Press. My guest is Emily Manna, a policy analyst for Open the Government, a nonpartisan coalition that advances government transparency and accountability. She also has authored a citizen's guide called America's Forever Wars and the Secrecy That Sustains Them. Emily, welcome to Update One.
Thanks for having me.
A very interesting guide here, very detailed. First of all, let me ask you, what was the thinking? What was the motivation behind doing the research for this guide and writing it?
Well, as you said, we're Open the Government is a coalition dedicated to government transparency and accountability. And one of the areas of our government that is most highly shrouded in secrecy is the military and the national security agencies. And at this point, that the U.S. has been involved in wars for nearly 18 years straight, we've really noticed kind of a troubling trend where not only is the amount of secrecy at the government level increasing, but it also feels that these wars have become so normalized that the public doesn't necessarily feel that they have the right to kind of know what's happening in the military and overseas. It feels like a lot of the public is kind of content to just leave that all to the experts, leave it to the military, leave it to the government, and not ask questions and just say that's the realm of national security. We don't need to know. And we find that really troubling because without a public demand for transparency and information, there is no oversight and there is no accountability. So what we tried to do through the guide, and we've been taking that around the country to a few different cities to try and speak to the public, is just to show folks the ways in which these wars are not only having a tremendous impact overseas, but are also impacting the public here at home domestically, why they should care, and why, most importantly, why they have a right to know what the government and the military are doing in their name.
Now, you mentioned this information becoming harder for the public to find. Why is that? Why do you think the government has become more secretive regarding this information?
Well, national security secrecy, excessive secrecy has always been a huge problem, of course. It was a problem in the Obama administration, in the Bush administration, and long before that. But we have seen during the Trump administration, we have seen a kind of accelerated expansion of secrecy that just seems to be coming out of kind of a culture of secrecy that exists in this administration that is not unique. The Obama administration had a lot of the same issues, but does seem to be growing at a faster pace. And so, for example, we've seen the Pentagon. Now it's been over a year since the Pentagon last held a televised press briefing. We've seen that DoD has stopped releasing a lot of information about airstrike targeting in Iraq and Syria that used to be released routinely to the public. We've seen restrictions in the amount of data being collected in Afghanistan. So, for example, data that used to be released on whether territory is controlled by the Afghan government or the Taliban, this has stopped being released to the public, stopped being collected altogether, in fact. So, we have kind of seen slowly over time a real withdrawal from transparency in the Pentagon specifically.
And you also said something else very interesting. the public not feeling it has a right to know what's going on and maybe not pushing for this information like it would have in the past. Why those feelings?
Well, it's also become so normalized, this idea that at any time an official mentions national security, we just kind of take for granted that that information is secret, and any release of any of that information would be harmful to the troops or harmful to the government, harmful to the country. And that's just not true. National security overclassification in the government is a massive problem. Again, has been for decades. Current and former government officials have estimated that anywhere between 50 to 90% of government information that is currently classified could safely be released to the public. So this is a massive cultural issue within government, and it's not enough to just say, oh, this concerns national security, and so therefore none of it can be released to the public. And essentially, all that really leads to at the end of the day is there's all kinds of waste of taxpayer dollars, abuses, things like that get covered up because it's just easier to say, well, this has to do with national security, so we keep it secret. So, it's really important that we start to push back a lot more vehemently on that trend. And make sure that the public understands that it's so crucial that there's as much transparency as is possible.
This is a very detailed report, this Citizens Guide that you've compiled. And when we talk about the ongoing wars, the simultaneous wars, we're talking about how many? About 13, all since 2001?
I mean, it really depends how you count it. And part of the issue there is that we just don't really know. We don't really know all the places that U.S. troops are engaged. We don't know which countries are considered war zones versus outside of war zones. It's all of that information is really being kept secret. And as the reliance on special forces also increases, we have a lot less information. Journalists can't necessarily embed with a special forces unit and go to the front lines and report back to the public what they see that's happening. So this kind of growing secrecy just increases and increases, partly because of the nature of these wars themselves, and also because of the very intentional drawbacks of transparency that I mentioned.
Okay, so the intentional drawbacks of transparency. Ideally, what would you like to see the government do in terms of becoming more transparent?
Obviously, first and foremost, like to see just restoring those data releases that I mentioned before. The airstrikes in Iraq and Syria, the data collection on the ground in Afghanistan, and then ultimately expansion of that, because at the end of the day, the public right now doesn't have any idea of whether what we're doing overseas is successful or not. That statistic about territory in Afghanistan, the one that I mentioned, was kind of one of the primary ways that the public had for being able to assess, what is the state of play in Afghanistan right now? How much control does the government have versus the Taliban? What's happening? And what we had started to see over the years was that, in fact, the Taliban was controlling more and more territory. So that was a way for the public to view that and question, and say, is what we're doing over there working? Is it effective? Does something need to change? So without that kind of data, it's really impossible to tell. Additionally, this administration has rescinded a section of an executive order that President Obama had issued that required public reporting on CIA drone strikes and civilian casualties, any kind of statistics on those strikes whatsoever. There is now no requirement. Now, the administration already was not following that requirement. They were not reporting as they should have been. But now there is no requirement out there that's for any type of reporting on CIA drone strikes. So this program is now entirely shrouded in secrecy. So you've got government programs that are allowed to use lethal force that the public has absolutely no knowledge of, besides what is kind of leaked or dug up by reporters. There's no government reported information out there about what these programs are doing and where they're operating.
We've talked about government secrecy. We talked about citizens not knowing enough about what's going on for a couple of reasons. What about the findings of your report itself? Some of the major findings in terms of number of wars, casualties, amount of dollars being spent. Can you give us a rundown there?
The statistics that you're talking about specifically come from the Cost of War project at Brown University, which I would really encourage folks to check out in addition to checking out the guide. But I believe the statistic is that the average American has spent something like $23,000 on these wars since they started. There's some really kind of stunning statistics like that. There was also we found some really horrifying polling numbers. One poll in particular showed that the vast majority of respondents could not correctly name the year the Iraq War started. Another poll found that 40% of respondents did not know that we were still at war in Afghanistan. So there really is kind of a stunning lack of knowledge, I think, in the public. And that's just, Afghanistan and Iraq, which are the two most publicized of the wars that we're engaged in. That's to say nothing of Somalia and Yemen and Pakistan and any of these other places. So that was a huge point. I mean, the other major point I think in this guide is just to show the ways in which the war comes home after so many years. We've seen a massive erosion of civil liberties here in the U.S., most of which started out in programs that were ostensibly authorized and geared towards fighting international terrorism and targeting folks overseas, that eventually the authorities expanded and they turned homewards. And so expansion of surveillance programs and technologies and things like that, as well as just the tremendous cost on veterans and military families, a smaller and smaller percentage of whom are sharing a greater and greater part of the burden of these wars.
Now, I know you mentioned before we started the interview how you've tried to take this study, these findings around the country and expose them to the public. If you can talk about that effort,
Sure.
Where you've been and how you've been trying to reach the public.
Yeah, absolutely. We've been able to do 5 events so far, and it's been everywhere from Atlanta, Georgia to Utica, New York to Kansas City to Minneapolis. We've taken, kind of different slices of this issue to different communities with whom, it may resonate the most. So, for example, we went to Minneapolis and spoke with the Somali American community there in partnership with Amnesty International, who released a fantastic report earlier this year about civilian casualties from U.S. airstrikes in Somalia. And their work actually helped push the U.S. government to acknowledge more civilian casualties, which was a huge win for transparency. So we talked to the Somali American community there about that, why it's so important for them to be raising their voices and asking for more information, particularly because it's their, friends and family back home in Somalia who are bearing the brunt of U.S. airstrikes there. On the flip side of the spectrum, we spoke to Young Americans for Liberty at the University of Georgia about, separation of powers, the lack of congressional oversight of the military right now, the need to have a real congressional debate about authorizations for war, and Congress kind of reasserting its war authority. So it's really kind of been all over the spectrum, but really just trying to connect with whichever community we're speaking to about the slice of this issue that may affect them the most.
And obviously, you've picked a variety of areas, different people in those areas. What has the response been in general to your findings?
I'm going to sound contradictory because I just cited those poll numbers that showed a lack of knowledge, but I did think that speaking to people had, a little bit better understanding of what's happening than I expected. I just think, it's hard for people to feel like there is an avenue for them to actually do something about it and make a difference. And that maybe if they felt like there was something that they could do more directly, then maybe there wouldn't be as much, apathy or normalization of these issues. So we've tried to encourage folks to do things like file a Freedom of Information Act request, try to look for more information, ask your public officials, what are their positions on these issues? Just show them that their constituents care about what's happening overseas, show them that there's interest, show them, that you'd like to know that they have some kind of plan for ending endless wars or things like that. So, we've tried to give people those options for things that they can do.
Have they been receptive to those ideas?
I think so. I mean, it's always a little bit tough to kind of know, kind of what happens after you leave. But it does feel like people have been receptive. In some cases, with the Amnesty International report that I mentioned, we were specifically asking folks to contact their members of Congress and ask the military to investigate the claims that were made in these Amnesty International reports. And I know that we got quite a few folks to engage in that. So I think so. I think folks are receptive. I think there's started to be a little more of a national conversation about this, both with the kind of Democratic contenders for president, as well as with President Trump himself. There's been a lot more conversation on this issue in particular. So I'm hopeful that there will be more conversation about it leading up to the next presidential elections, and that, we can kind of keep that momentum going and show elected officials that this is an important issue to the public.
Was there timing in this report in terms of trying to expose this leading up to the 2020 presidential election?
That wasn't necessarily the initial intent. Last year, I think everyone was thinking a little bit more about midterm elections, but it has worked out that way in the sense that I think we're going to be thinking, about how this conversation continues in the fall. We're, of course, a C3 organization, so we don't get involved in electioneering, but we do want folks to be having that conversation. So we are going to be thinking about, the kind of locations where we're going, where there's a lot of political conversation happening, where are the hotspots, where people are having these kinds of conversations and hope to influence that conversation.
So you partially answered my next question, my final question. What do you hope happens next? You've compiled a very inclusive report, a lot of research, a lot of good information. You want the public to be more demanding in terms of the information they get. You want the government to be more open. What do you hope happens next?
We would like to hopefully engage more members of Congress in some of the events that we're putting on, and just really ensure that we're, connecting the communities and the places that we're going to their members of Congress to show, these are the people that are turning out to talk about this. These are your constituents, and hope to have some influence that way, as well as incorporate a little bit more of these types of issues into some of the already incredible planning that's going on among civil society for broader democracy reforms that can happen. There's no reason why this issue and these issues of foreign policy in general shouldn't be a part of that conversation. So I think we would really like to see that happen, and to see these kind of issue of endless war be less divorced from the general issues of democracy reform. Yeah.
Emily, nice job. Thanks for being on Update One.
Thanks for having me.
Emily Manna has been our guest on Update One, a policy analyst with Open the Government. I'm Mike Hempen. Thanks for listening. Update One is a production of the National Press Club's Broadcast Podcast Committee. You can comment on this podcast or any episode of Update One by sending an email to update1podcast, that's update the number 1 podcast @gmail.com. Thanks for listening to Update One.